Welcome to episode 16 of the Extremely Non-Extreme podcast. I am the host, Quentin Whitrock. Today, we embark on something new, a series of podcasts about policy issues. Issues, you say? What do policy and real substantive issues analysis have to do with politics? Well, for everyone who thinks the only things that matter in politics are the Epstein files, MAGA infighting, dementia in the White House, the Democratic Party dissension between the socialists and the so-called centrists, I'm here to tell you that policy does matter. We're going to start with the 10 policy statements listed in my Principle-Based Politics blog on November 24th, and we'll explore each one of them individually with guests on this podcast. I believe each statement to be a common sense policy position on which the vast majority of Americans agree. The first policy issue today relates to taxation, which is appropriate because, as they say, there are only two things sure in life, and they are death and taxes. Every American pays taxes. Everyone who even visits America pays taxes here of some sort. America needs to have and does have tax policies. So, drum roll, please. Taxpayers deserve reasonable taxation. That's my first policy statement. Taxpayers deserve reasonable taxation. And I guess we all would agree with that. The devil, of course, is in the details and exactly what taxation is reasonable. My guest to discuss those details today is Richard Shirk. Rich must be a tax lawyer, you might be guessing. Wrong. This guy is probably one of those egghead economists or accountants you might assume next. Wrong again. Rich Shirk is a taxpayer and not one who shirks on his payment of taxes. He spent his career in the food distribution business, but his education about taxes mostly comes from paying them and thinking and studying what is the right amount of taxes that Americans should pay. This guy is a thinker, a reasonable man, born and raised in the industrial city in Iowa, but spending his adult life doing business literally all over America from his company's headquarters in Minnesota. Welcome to the program, Rich Shirk.
It's nice to be here, Quentin. Thank you.
My first question for you today, Rich, has to do with America's financial situation. To put it bluntly, our country is broke. Our national debt is over $38 trillion. We pay over $1 trillion of interest a year on that debt. We also spend over $4 trillion annually on the military, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and federal employee pensions alone. These are things we have to pay. Therefore, we have no money left to pay our other bills since our total tax revenue is only $5 trillion. This all is on pace to get worse and worse. Rich, as a businessman, would you say the basic solution is to bring in more revenue by raising federal taxes or to decrease expenses?
Well, Quentin, you're going to force me to kind of give up my game here early on. And I think the most reasonable position here is that if we truly want to resolve the issue, we can't be dogmatic either on the revenue side or the spending side, because both of them are a problem. And so, as you just mentioned, our tax revenues don't cover our mandatory spending, let alone when we throw in discretionary spending. So, my short answer is we got to do both. It's as simple as that. Any reasonable solution is going to involve both some changes on the spending side and changes on the taxing side. But first, I want to give us some, kind of give the lay of the land here. The the debt facts. There's a lot of issues. China is buying us. Japan owns us, all those sorts of things. And the fact of the matter is that 77% of all U.S. debt is owned either by you and I, John Q. Public, um, or lending institutions, banking institutions in the country, uh, and the federal government and state governments and so on down the line. The long and short of that answer is that 77% of all of our debt is domestic debt. The remaining 23%, um, Japan is the largest debt holder at $1.1 trillion. China is next at $800 billion, and Japan comes in third at $700 billion. The UK is there. Total foreign debt is somewhere in the range of $8 trillion out of that $38 trillion. So it, it's a little bit of hyperbole to say that we're being bought and owned by these foreign entities. And I think that we need to keep that in mind as we go through this discussion, because as taxpayers and as debt holders ourselves, um, some of that debt is actually wealth in our hands. So maybe debt to the foreign government, or excuse me, to the federal government, but it's wealth when it's held in our hands. Savings bonds, so on and so forth.
You mean the public? Well, let's talk first. I agree with you that there is a problem both on the revenue and on the expense side. And we have to start somewhere. Let's start with taxes. Based on principle-based politics principles of freedom and free enterprise, along with limited government, which I believe very strongly about, as I believe everyone knows, I've taken the position that taxes should not be imposed beyond what is absolutely necessary to pay off federal debts as they come due and to fund essential and properly budgeted government services. Other than for those necessities, I say the principle of freedom leaves no room to take the earnings or profits away from any taxpayer. In addition, I believe that free enterprise says our national economy does better when resources are allocated by businesses rather than central government, capitalism. Are we in agreement?
Since this is principle-based politics, I would say in principle, yes. Now, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, the devil is in the details. So define what that small government means precisely. Um, Explain what essential and properly budgeted government services means. What does that include? Um, is there some absolute standard of small government? Say it can only be a certain percentage of GDP, or whose definition applies? Generally, we're talking about whichever party is in power. Their definition of small government is the one that implies. So I will take a little bit of a twist on your definition. Say I'm in favor of the smallest government necessary to accomplish the goals set out for that government by the voters and by Congress. Um, you know, there are some among us who have advocated for a proposition that says 99% for defense and 1% for everything else. Does that really work? Is that doable? That does that define small government? I'm not sure. And then moving on to um, the question of allocation. Um, I am I am for effective regulation, not overregulation. And I don't think there's any question that at times our economy has been overregulated. But just speaking in terms of economics, which I studied a little bit at the Harvard of Upper Northwest, South Central, Eastern Blackhawk County in Iowa, which is University of Northern Iowa. Um, uh, Completely unregulated economies will always begin as an open and is an open and competitive economy. But over time, they will tend towards concentration and then oligopoly and ultimately monopoly. And we've seen that in a number of cases in our fairly recent past. So think about airlines. In the 1960s, how many airlines did we have? Today, we have a number of small regional carriers, but we really have four major airlines that dominate that industry. Think about banking. In the 1970s and 1980s, how many national banks did we have? By national, I don't mean national chartered banks, but large banks that did business on a national basis. And since the repeal of Glass-Steagall, that number has declined until we have a handful of banks that are literally too large to fail, so that if any one of them went down, it could potentially take the entire economy down. Um, the tech industry, Texas Utilities is a good example. Back about, I don't know, 20 or 25 years ago, Texas made a decision to deregulate um, their electrical utilities to open it up to brokers and small providers. They started out with roughly 600 and some um, providers of electrical service within the state. Today, three large companies have 70% share of that business. And think about the collapse of their grid in 2021, in February of 2021, as a direct result of the profit motive. The There was more money to be made by not investing in the grid, by milking it as far as they could, which resulted in lack of investment, lack of technological upkeep, and cold weather hit, it collapsed. The, the net result to the consumer was that virtually, because the electrical bills were unregulated, virtually all of the cost savings that had been realized over the previous 20 years were completely wiped out in that one incident
Hmm.
because the utilities, the electrical providers, jacked up their emergency rates to the point where people had been paying, this isn't an absolute uh, example, but for instance, they've been paying $30 a month for electric power, and now in the course um, of this crisis, they're paying 1,000 or 1,200 bucks, and because it's completely based on a demand and supply.
So you're arguing that government can't be so small that we have no regulation and we have monopolies all over the place. But does it matter who is paying the taxes? We hear a lot today about solving the budgetary problems by taxing the rich. And I don't mean you, Rich Shirk, or tax the billionaires, which probably would not affect either you or me. Would it work? I mean, can we get there by taxing these big corporations and taxing the billionaires?
Um, yes, to an extent. I am an advocate as much as possible for broadening the tax base. Pull in as many taxpayers as we can. Um, in 2009, less than half of the American taxpayers actually owed federal income tax. Now, there has been some improvement in that over the last 15 or 16 years, in that, in 2018, that number declined to 44% who didn't pay any income tax. And in 2024, that number declined to 40%. So we went from 51% of the taxpayers carrying the load to 60%. So we have broadened the tax base to a certain extent, and that's all good. But at the upper reaches of the tax schedule, progressivity breaks down dramatically. And so, if you're among the highest annual earners in the country, your tax rate actually starts to drop relative to the rest of the taxpayer base. So, you know, at the just as a kind of example, I went through this as I was preparing for the 63 wealthiest individuals and families in the United States in 2024 owned more wealth or had collected more wealth than the entire bottom 50%, 170, roughly 170 million people, by 63 individuals or families control more wealth than the entire bottom 170 million. And the top 10% control 60% of all the wealth in the country. So I do believe that that progressivity in the tax code is called for. Clearly, we do have a progressive tax code now, but you know, the wealthiest individuals, they don't live off a salary like you and I do, or like I'm sure most of your listeners do. So they don't live off a salary. So, a pure income tax doesn't really affect them, doesn't have the same impact on them that you and I see, because they're living off of things like capital gains, and interest, and or some kind of tax-free income shelters and that sort of thing. That
The latest trick, I believe, is to take loans and then
Correct.
spend the money you borrow so that you don't have any income.
That's exactly right. They borrow against their assets for their living expenses, and so they're essentially they're living tax free. That you and I both know that's not entirely true, but that's where the progressivity in the income tax schedules begin to break down.
Well, an argument certainly can be made that there are excessive disparities in wealth. Uh, but let's talk about whether there's an effective way to reduce those disparities through our federal tax process. And I believe that most wealth is achieved through corporations or the old fashioned way through inheritance. Would it be a win win to raise rates or eliminate deductions and exemptions for businesses or estates?
Let's kind of establish a baseline understanding of what we're talking about here. In 1980, there were 13 billionaires in the United States. In 2024, there are 813 billionaires in the United States, and that number is growing. Worldwide, in 1980, there were something like 40 or 45 billionaires, and today there's 2,800. Now, of course, that's kind of irrelevant, but it's just to demonstrate how dramatically wealth has flowed up in the country. Um, and so at the same time, a 1980 dollar is worth $3.74 today. So if those numbers were correlated, the number of billionaires and the wealth held by that group has far outstripped inflation. Um, and in the 1960s, the average CEO's pay was roughly 20 to 30 times what the average worker was. In the 1980s, that went up to around 50 times. Today, it's 350 times what the average worker on the floor makes. Now, as just kind of a personal example of that, when I was a young man, I worked at John Deere. I built tractors in Waterloo, Iowa, while I was going to college. In the last year that I worked for John Deere, um, I made roughly $30,000. And that was a lot of money in 1980. That was a very comfortable living in 1980. The CEO was a guy named Bill Hewitt, and he was the last of the Deere family to run the company. And he made somewhere in the range of 2 million bucks. And I don't think anybody thought that was unfair compensation for somebody running a company that size. My brother just retired from John Deere recently as a skilled tractor or as a skilled mechanic. In other words, he was the guy that kept all the machinery running in the factory, and that's one of the highest pay grades in the company, and he made somewhere between 65 and $70,000 uh, that year. That same year, the CEO of John Deere made $36 million. So while the guy on the floor, their average paycheck basically doubled from what I was making then at that point in time, the the CEO's paycheck went up 600 times. 600%, over 600%. So, there's an imbalance in equity there, I would say. And, some CEOs become billionaires off of stock grants and stock options. And I, as a shareholder, I'm not sure that's true. I mean, does Elon Musk deserve $1 trillion pay package? We're stretching the bounds of credulity here. So now that's a lot to get to your question. I'm a firm believer that we need to find whatever waste, fraud, and abuse there is in the tax system. Absolutely, that goes without saying. There's procurement fraud, there are overpayments, there are duplicative departments. I mean, the easiest one to point out is within the Defense Department and the defense structure, there are 18 separate intelligence agencies. Do we really need 18 separate intelligence agencies?
Now you're talking
Somebody,
about the expense side and the size of
I am.
government. And
I'm talking about, well, but that's true. I'm talking about the expense side, but at the same time, I'm talking about finding waste, fraud, and abuse wherever it exists in the government. Um, you
if
know,
taxpayers aren't paying their fair taxes, that's another form of tax
that's
fraud.
another that is another issue. But getting back directly to your question, eliminating unproductive corporate deductions and exemptions, just makes sense, I think. I mean, we spend roughly $5 billion a year on subsidies to the oil companies, which are among the most profitable companies in the country, generally speaking. Everybody can point to a down year here and there, but generally speaking, the large oil companies are among the most profitable in the country. Do we really need to give them $5 billion a year in subsidies? But on the other hand, you know, in 2016, the government spent $7.4 billion in subsidies for renewable energy, for wind and solar and so forth. In 2022, that went up to 15.6 billion. So the question is, do we need to compensate companies for doing business effectively? Or in some cases, are we providing incentive for to create new technologies and new industries that are going to carry us into the future, while legacy companies are they've got their business model. Do we need to be subsidizing that business model? At the very least, I would say we need to eliminate loopholes and simplify the entire tax code. There's a myth out there that the tax code is 75,000 pages, and most of that is simply explanatory information. But the tax code does run to 6, 7, 8,000 pages. Let's simplify it.
Well, that's the deductions and exemptions that I'm talking
Right,
about.
right.
Right now, estates, I think the number might be $15 million. If you have that amount in your estate or less, you don't pay any federal income taxes. And so you could pass that 15 million on to your heirs. If you have $150 million, you do pay federal income taxes. And then there's the capital gains associated with estates. You come from Iowa, I come from Iowa. Many people have their wealth in land, and farmers cannot pass on that land to their heirs until they die, because if they pass it on before death, there is a great increase in value that has occurred during the time the taxpayer owned that land, and they have to pay capital gains taxes on that at the rate of 20%. Do we charge too much or too little in capital gains taxes? And what do you think of the rules on capital gains taxes?
That's I'm not sure I'm able to answer that. I don't know. I would like to say that, there is some appropriate level of taxation for capital gains, for accrued wealth over time. I don't really know what that is, and I'm not going to propose some arbitrary answer, but I tend to think that if we made the tax code simpler, improved our progressivity schedules, eliminated, loopholes and deductions, is our favorite president used to say, let's get our tax returns down to a postcard. You know, if we actually did that, I think it would resolve a lot of the issues that are present today. Um, and I'll just make an editorial comment here. The most prosperous time in American history was the 1950s, say the mid 1950s, up through the 1970s. There was a period of about 20 years there where the class grew successively up through the late 70s to encompass about roughly 65% of all of us. Um, and that was the high water mark. That was the high water mark. It was a period of greatest wealth equality in the country. And there were sustained periods of relatively high growth, between 4% on the low side and 7 and 8% on the high side during that time. And I don't know, roughly every 4 years or so, there'd be a downturn. If it wasn't a recession, there would be some kind of an economic slowdown. But on balance, over that period of time, we had really remarkable sustained growth. Now, that's also the period of time where we had the highest marginal tax rates in the country, in our history. It of course during World War II and shortly after they reached 91 to 94%. But there's a long period of time up to the early 60s where that highest marginal tax rate was 90%. And after that, I believe in 1963 or so, roughly, it declined to 70%, and then it declined to 50% in the when was that?
I think that was in the
Roughly the
90s, perhaps.
1970s, 80s, and then under Reagan it dropped dramatically from 50% down to around 30%. It's bounced up and down from there in the last 45 years, but basically it's been in the 30 to 35%
Yeah,
range. So
36%
isn't it
now, I think.
striking though that the period of greatest prosperity, most economic growth in our history correlates with the period of highest marginal tax rates. So honestly, I think there are some answers to our problems in the progressivity rates of in the tax code.
Well, if
And it
I've always been a strong believer, Rich, that if you want more of something, you stop taxing it. And if you want less of something, you tax it. So if we tax the accumulation of wealth, or we tax high pay packages for CEOs at some disproportionate level, there we will see less of that because people will not be incentivized to go out and create great wealth for their shareholders, for example, and they won't be incentivized to keep earning great earnings after they have enough money to live off of because they'll have less incentive because they don't want to just give their money to Uncle Sam to at some point. So what some politicians are advocating for, and this is popular amongst the Bernie Sanderses of the world and people like that, is wealth taxes, pure wealth taxes. I guess that would mean that anybody over a certain net worth, regardless of how much income they had, maybe they're like me and they don't have any income, but maybe they have assets that they're living off of, that they fork over a percentage of those assets every year. Would that work? Is there anything to be said for that?
um I think there is, as long as we don't get stupid about it. I it's given our conversation a few minutes ago, we know that these people of high net worth generally don't live off, a salary or income the way the rest of us understand it. Um, if we are serious about reducing the national debt and balancing the annual budget, do we have any other options? What other options are there than to tax a certain amount of that wealth? And I don't know, Elon Musk is worth $400 billion. Do I really think that some kind of minimal wealth tax is going to disincentivize him? I don't think so. And for many people of high net worth, I I, I don't think so. And then the question becomes, where are they going to go to avoid it? How are they going to avoid it? Are they going to move to the Bahamas? Uh, no. Are they going to stop doing business in the United States? No. Um, but they're going to continue to work as hard as they can to acquire whatever they can. Now, certainly there is some disincentive to taxes. I'm very open to that argument. But if we're serious about managing the national debt, then we have to go after um, whatever pools of resources we can find. And at the present time, we're not doing that. And given the current state of our tax code, it's an impossibility. We simply, we cannot cut our way. Even though I'm a firm believer in efficient government, we can't. It's impossible to cut our way out of the debt that we've got.
Well, you
The
look at
only
Doge.
way
That
is,
was the purpose of Doge, was to try to reduce the budget by cutting waste, fraud, and abuse. And they found some outrageous expenditures of money, and that all bogged down. And then there was consternation between Trump and Musk. And pretty soon, when it's all said and done, Doge is now out of business, and I don't know that they saved a nickel. And we spend more money than we did before. So,
I think, Doge, the the expressed um, intent of Doge was fine. The way they actually executed it was horrific. They didn't, they're in order to go find waste, fraud, and abuse, you got to spend some time doing research. All they did was take a meat cleaver to agencies without any, frankly, without any investigation as to whether or not they were effective, or, it was, I hate to say it, but it was simply an ideological exercise.
well,
Now, if it
it was
was,
all for show, in my
yeah,
opinion.
yeah, but something like that, quite frankly, Obama did eliminate a significant significant expenditures in the federal government, but they took time. They took several years to research and discover where those inefficiencies were at before they actually executed on it. And and those were sustainable. Quite frankly, what Doge has done is create an unsustainable situation where they're actually spending more money to hire back and to fix what they screwed up. So, that was not an exercise in efficiency as far as I can see. But um, you, you know, as as Willie Sutton said one time, I asked, why does he rob banks? He says, well, that's where the money's at. Okay, where's the money at? That's what we've got to do. Um, none of us like the idea of paying more taxes, but the reality is there is simply no other way to get out of the problem that we're in.
Well, let's talk about spending a little bit more. I had a guest on this podcast uh, early on who had, like you, been an executive at a large corporation. And he said if his corporation ever was in a budget crunch, which the United States certainly is, with revenue of 5 trillion and expenses of 7 trillion, that's a budget crunch. He said the CEO, the board of directors, would mandate that all department heads find a way to reduce their expenses accordingly. And maybe not across the board, but mandate that this department cut their expenses by 20% and another by 10%, and whatever worked, and that would be a place to start. Did that ever happen at any company you ever worked at
You
where you had to
know,
cut your expenses?
I can't say that we ever had an experience with across the board expense cuts, but we did utilize zero-based budgeting, which says you begin with what you got this year, what your budget is this year, and figure out if you can do it again next year without an increase. Now, at the same time, you had to figure out how to increase revenue.
Yes.
But that was a challenge. For many years where I was at, we didn't do that. But I would say for probably, maybe the last 8 or 9 years that before I retired, we worked off zero-based budgets, and it really made you stop to think about what you're doing. How could you be more efficient with the resources that you actually had? So, something like that could work. And at some point in time, I'm not sure that just wholesale across the board cuts are effective, because sometimes you're cutting your nose off to spite your face. You're taking money out of the pots that are actually making you money. Um,
Well,
and
I
but
agree with that. But I do believe we have a spending problem. I think it's by definition we have a spending problem if our spending is greater than our revenues. Uh, and presidents and Congresses, similar to my uncle who used to dress up as Santa Claus at this time of year, they like to be viewed as generously passing out gifts to good little girls and boys and even to adults. And the common courtesy wasn't to ask this Uncle Santa how much the presents cost, and he never really mentioned that they actually were bought and paid for by the kid's own parents. Uncle Sam, by contrast, to jolly old Uncle Santa from Christmases past, does get pressed for answers regarding the goodies he wants to hand out. We do expect our politicians, at least I do, to tell us in advance how much things will cost, and we do need to know where the money will come from. And I see very little emphasis on that in Washington, D.C. It Unnecessary spending causes taxes to be higher than they should, debt to be higher than it was, and necessary spending to be jeopardized. What can we do
but
to fix that?
that's a great question. Because I agree with you. There is absolutely no question that there is inefficient spending going on. And I say I agree with you wholeheartedly. Go after it. Um, I think that any program that is going to be implemented where it's appropriate, I mean, this wouldn't apply to all programs, but they should be means tested. Can they pay for themselves? Do they need to exist? Um, Implement strong and independent inspectors general. Unfortunately, we've seen a deterioration in that function recently, but I would encourage the government to go back to that strong, independent inspectors general, but with clearly defined mandates, not some kind of vague general mandate, clearly defined mandates on what and how to pursue inefficiency or wrongdoing. And we need to maintain strong and independent audit departments. Um, and much of that has been gutted recently. So with adequate staffing and appropriate technology to do the job. And unfortunately, oftentimes, as we've seen with air traffic control, the government has tended to put off technological advancements. Let's make do with what we've got. And quite frankly, in many of these areas, the government should be at the cutting edge of technology, not lagging years behind. And just simply don't create and fund new programs that don't actually fill a need.
Yep.
We've seen a lot of that
And
over,
get rid
over
of the
these.
redundant ones that we have.
Both parties have been guilty of that without question.
Now, there's one last big elephant in the room, although parties would argue about whether this is an elephant or a donkey. Entitlements. The majority of our spending are these entitlements that I mentioned earlier: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and federal employee pensions. What can we do other than taking away grandma's Social Security and cutting poor children off of Medicaid to to reform entitlements?
Well, I've thought about this a bit over the last several years, frankly, since I'm a beneficiary these days. Um, change, I think everyone can agree that changes need to be made. It's imperative that changes need to be made. They don't need to be made um, today, but we need to begin making changes today. Um, Again, I'll go back to something I said a few minutes ago. All of these programs, all of these entitlement programs should be means tested. Um, so um, if you're in the top 1%, the average net worth of somebody in the top 1% is $14 million. If somebody has a net worth of $14 million, should they really be eligible for Social Security? I don't know. They need to be means tested. Draw the line is wherever you want, but after that, enforce it. Um, I've seen numbers that say the average net worth of the top 1/10% is, $40 million. Maybe that's the right number. I don't know, but they should be means tested. We're going to have to increase the tax rate. We're going to have to increase the withholding rate. And if you really want to, if you really want to make it effective and cut into the deficit in this area, remove the income cap. Just as there's no income cap on Medicare, remove the income cap on Social Security.
Well,
And
even though, yeah, Social Security, when my pay would reach a certain amount for the year, maybe it's August, I don't have to deduct Social Security anymore after
right,
that
right,
when
right.
I was working.
That's
And
exactly right.
that's a great blessing to have, but I don't think I needed it. And I don't think Elon Musk needs to stop paying Social Security paying into Social Security after his first
Right.
tenth of one paycheck.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. The last one, well, the last two, the fourth one here is slowly over time increase the age of eligibility.
Yep.
We are living longer, we're working longer, and I think it's just inevitable that at some point in time we've got to increase that age of eligibility.
And what you're talking about there is maybe anybody who's 52 or under or 55 and under right now just needs to be told right now, you're not going to be able to start drawing Social Security at 62 and a half. You're going to have to wait till you're a couple years
Correct.
older than that.
That's correct. That's exactly right. I mean, this can be any number of years down the road, but I'm not going to tell somebody that's 62 today that they can't retire tomorrow. I'm
Right.
gonna we're gonna we're gonna make that decision, but the enforcement date is 10 years down the road, whatever it may be. Give people a chance to, one, adjust to the thought process, and two, prepare themselves for that eventuality. And uh, maybe in 10 years the retirement age goes up to 68, and another 5 years after that it goes up to 68 and a half, something like that. I don't know. I am kind of astonished at the number of people that I run into that are in their late 60s that are still working and planning to work for some time. So increasing the age of eligibility. And then finally, and this isn't directly related to Social Security, but I would say, well, it is actually directly related. The indexing, improve the indexing formulas for CPI calculations and that sort of thing. Those tend to be a little bit off. And I don't know how much savings there might be with that. But, when, as Everett Dirksen said, billionaire and a billionaire, and eventually you're talking about a lot of money, you know?
Yep.
So the same thing applies here.
All right. Well, why don't
Most of
we?
these people probably don't know who Everett Dirksen was.
Oh yeah, yeah, former from New York, right?
Illinois.
Illinois. Yeah, that's
Mhm.
right. Well, why don't we close on that note? This has been very helpful, Rich, and I'll have you back again sometime when I want to talk more about taxes and spending. I think our conclusion is cutting spending where possible is always a good thing. Raising taxes selectively may be necessary in some regards. And in the meantime, we're going to have to keep borrowing more money, which is painful. But so are cutting spending and so are raising taxes. Every option we have is painful, right?
That is the ultimate truth. And but to I'll close on this. Um, we are $38 trillion in debt. Um, Keep in mind a couple of things. One, that telling the government that they have to have a balanced budget is a really bad idea. The worst financial panic of the 19th century was the Panic of 1837, which immediately followed Andrew Jackson paying off the federal debt. The only time in our history that the United States has ever been debt-free was under Andrew Jackson. That precipitated the worst panic of the 19th century. And the six worst um, financial crises of our leading up to and including the Great Depression all followed retrenchment of government spending. So I'm not saying that government spending isn't a good thing. I would follow your formula, necessary and efficient government spending. And finally, we're not broke. The government might be broke. The country actually has a net worth of somewhere, okay, this is according to the Federal Reserve's consumer finance survey of consumer finance. Uh, the United States actually has a net worth of somewhere between 120 and 135 trillion dollars. So the country is not broke. The government might be broke. Now the question is, how do we fix the problem the government has?
All right. Well, I feel a lot better now. And one of the reasons I feel better is because I feel like I accomplished the purpose I have for this series of issue discussions on the Extremely Non-Extreme podcast. And that purpose is to demonstrate that these are not soundbite issues. These, people spout off sound bites when they're trying to get elected, but these are complex, difficult issues with no perfect answers. And the other side is never doing the exact wrong thing.
Right.
These are shades of gray and multifaceted. And you, with your intellect, Rich, have been the perfect person to discuss them just person to person, business person, lay person, not economist, accountant, or politician, having a discussion about what can we as a country do to improve our government's financial situation. So thank you for that, and it was a pleasure to have you, Rich.
Thank you, Quentin. It's been an honor, and I really, really appreciate what you're doing with your podcast and with your blog. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. And we'll be back again with another episode soon on another one of these issues. So sign up for our blog, if anyone who's listening, at principle-based-politics.org. There's a sign up whereby I will send you by email links to every podcast and every blog post that we do. Thank you all for your attention and have a great day.